Okay, in part two, I'm going to discuss the ethical city within this context of what we described as the inferno, although we're actually borrowing that term from a quite famous writer who I will mention in one moment. And we're going to discuss a whole range of disruptive forces that you as strategic urban planners, sustainability planners need to be thinking about. And before I continue, I just want to point out that the artwork that I'm sharing here is by an artist, a UK artist who's based in Hong Kong, Louise Soloway Chan. And these are bas reliefs that you can find in one of the subway stations. And I saw them one day when I was in Hong Kong and took a photo of them because it just sort of captures the vibrancy and also her love of the cities, which I think is very, very powerful. And the other person who I think really has a love affair with cities is Italo Calvino. I'm not sure if you've come across his book, Invisible Cities, but it was very, very influential on our writing. And in fact, we start many of our chapters with a quote from Calvino. In the story, Marco Polo is basically talking to Kubla Khan and describing all of the great cities in the empire of Kubla Khan. And actually, at one point in the conversation, they're talking about, what's the inferno of living. And I think Marco Polo says that the inferno of living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here, the inferno where we live every day, that we form by being together. And I tend to think that sort of captures modern life and modern cities as being an inferno. And so we see it in our book, this inferno, on the notion of relentless disruption, as combining a number of different forces. And these are just some examples. They're not the only ones, but this, the implications of AI and automation, the need to respond to climate change, the impacts of climate change, but also going net zero, the global financial crashes that continually occur, and then most recently the global pandemic. And we were writing this book in the middle of the pandemic, so it's very much uppermost on our mind. But it's not like, the COVID will go away and then these disruptive forces will end. We'll actually see ourselves as in a situation of ongoing disruption, and that's the new normal. That's how we plan. That's what we prepare for. This is interesting because a year ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, Joe Revetz from Manchester University, he put together this really interesting graphic. And I think at the time we were all hoping that within a year, COVID would have gone away, but many of these tendencies that he describes in this graphic are actually ongoing. So for instance, there was a notion of, well, we'll try to get back to normal as quickly as possible. And that business as usual, let's go out and shop again. But there's also some people who see this as an opportunity to implement a lot of new ideas, and that's including myself and my co-authors, and that's called the new panarchy. So there were lots of things that were already there, and they go mainstream as a result of the pandemic. And then, and that's sort of this societal transition encourages that to happen, but inertia tries to push us back to, oh, I just want things to be back to normal. I want to be able to fly. I want to be able to go shopping. I want to go on holiday, so on. I want to go back to the way things were before the pandemic. And then we're all experiencing the real virtuality. For students particularly, very, very challenging. For many academics, actually they took easily to this. They're quite happy to give a talk from their office, to go online. But there's a downside to it, which is this sort of lockdown city. Now in Australia, you're kind of out of that lockdown phase, but here in Japan we have a a national emergency ongoing, and in other parts of the world, the situation is much more difficult. But it's also a time when you see power grabs going on. You see new legislation that's sort of brought in or around surveillance and tracking and so on and so forth. So we have to keep an eye out on that. But there's also this notion of, well, safe zone residents only, and it even goes to borders where you say, well, we're not going to let people into our country from this red list of countries. So we're still in the middle of it. We don't know what's going to happen, but again, it just shows you probably all of these things are going to happen at the same time, and it's something to be aware of as they play out. For instance, COVID has had a huge impact on the high street. Many store closures. Here's reports from the BBC. In the UK, in Japan, we have a similar phenomenon where we've seen many. They have something called the Shotengai, which is a shopping arcade, and we're increasingly talking about shuttered Shotengai, where many of the stores are closed. In contrast, there's also been a lot of innovation, and lots of new practices have been introduced around takeaway and so on and so forth, or online shopping. But there's a question of like, okay, what's going to happen after COVID? Will the high streets revive? We don't really know. But these are just examples of the ongoing impacts. Next, we're going to see automation becoming, and that's also tied in, maybe tied into COVID. It's tied into the shift to everything going online. But there is a suggestion that as automation increases, the job market will shrink. There is a lot of controversy around this, and there's some who argue that people just change professions, that new professions emerge, that we shouldn't really worry about it. But let's just say that this is going to be an ongoing disruptive force, not just in Australia, but in other parts of the world. So here's a report from Brookings looking in the US, looking at the impacts of automation and artificial intelligence. So they say it varies via professions, but which also vary geographically in terms of where you have certain professions clustered and so on certain new industries emerging. But yeah, just think about the major impact that this is going to have on employment. For instance, truck drivers may be replaced by autonomous vehicles. These are sort of very huge impacts that we can expect. And one of the presidential candidates for the US, Yang, this was one of his major platforms. What is going to be the impact of AI and automation on the economy, but also on urban farm. Again, in Australia, we're likely to see very significant impacts distributed across the country. And this report by McKinsey and Company is a really interesting start point for those of you who want to dig deeper into it. Going on at the same time as the pandemic and automation and AI, we have the climate emergency. And this is just from the UK. And there's a very interesting paper that was put out actually from some colleagues at RMIT University, Susie Maloney. I think she's moved on now, but they were looking at, what does a climate declaration, emergency declaration mean? And they pointed at a few things. One is it can stimulate new governance models. And the other thing is they need to be tied into actual action plans. So we're seeing more and more ambitious action plans emerging, and we're seeing the 2030 date, net zero by 2030, emerging more and more frequently at the local level. And this is just a picture across the UK of the extent of coverage of these declarations, basically divided into the net zero target date there. So we have 2024 in red being the most ambitious. Look at Copenhagen, they're going net zero by 2025, Oslo by 2030. Newcastle, that's Newcastle in the United Kingdom, not Newcastle in Australia, 2030. So that's a decade of very, very significant changes if they're really serious about becoming net zero. And it's essentially about completely transforming how the economy works, mobility, energy, and so on. And in my opinion, the more rapid that we can achieve this transformation, the better. So I'm really in favor of the notion of accelerated decarbonization. Here's an example from Leeds in the UK. What I really like about this particular emission reduction pathway is the way that it's been broken down. So it's broken down into economically viable. This is something that we can do very easily, and we can afford it. Then the next one is, well, this is much more expensive, but it's technically viable. So there's a whole bunch of measures that we can run there. And then there's a third category, which is innovative actions that will help us to sort of bridge that gap and get closer to net zero. And then the fourth category is the behavioral actions that are required. And that's basically changing things like diets and so on. And so you have a combination of all of these measures that will allow a city like Leeds in England progress to net zero. I think it's by 2035 in this particular instance. And I think you should look in any climate action plan for that level of detail, because otherwise they're just kind of, I don't know, waving the flag, but not necessarily serious about doing anything in a very near term and at a high pace. So we identified 4 orientations for cities, which I think are very important for you to take into consideration. A lot of the work in academia, from the 70s onwards, was really around this notion of globally competitive cities. So a lot of people like, say, Peter Hall or Saskia Sassens have been writing about global cities. And I think that's really, really interesting. So you've got like, Paris, New York, London, Tokyo, those are the global cities. A lot of attention goes into how they function. And we see them as sort of, hubs totally integrated into the world economy. They're headquarters for transnational corporations. They're where the international capital is focused, but they also have this spatial polarization of class that I talked about within the context of London. But too much attention is paid to those cities, and they're fine. They can take care of themselves. They have a high, technical skills within the governments there. But then we started to see this shift in more recent years to focus on livability. And I think that ties into what's coming out of Australia, a lot of the work, but there's also places like Vienna and Osaka that are seen as livable cities. And so there's an emphasis on the local lived experience, but there's also, what's the spatial variability of services and infrastructure, the core versus the suburbs. How do we deal with poverty? And then also how do we measure it? How do we measure livability? Is it about walkability, mobility, or open space, housing, affordability, and so on? So 2 areas where I think not enough attention is given is this notion of feral, fragile, and fragmented cities, which is a very large proportion of cities around the world, particularly in the so-called global south, and it's places like Dakar, Rio de Janeiro, but even also in the global north of these formerly industrialized, the Rust Belt areas of the US, the northern cities of the UK, where you see that either they're dealing with very rapid growth, population growth, or they're dealing with rapid industrial decline or change in industrial structure. And you find, as a result, that local governments are able to provide the basic services, that there's poverty, inequality, and in many instances, violence. And if you look at some of the sort of fragile, feral cities in the global south, you even have subsistence economies, black markets, illegal commerce, and so on taking place, almost replacing what you would see as the normal economy of a city. And then the area that we focus our attention on in our book, Ethical Cities, is also this notion of fight back cities, fearless, rebellious, and ethical. And there's quite a few interesting cities now that are emerging that are pushing back against the sort of the neoliberal capitalist economy. And Barcelona is a good example, Preston in the UK, Cleveland in the US. And so they're searching for new forms of municipalism, so how to reinvent the local state. And they see public engagement. In Barcelona, they talk about the term of governance by obeying. In other words, you have to obey what the public want. That there's also these new institutional structures around co-ops or participatory budgeting and so on that try to bring people more into decision making. And ultimately, it's about reinventing the local economy. There's lots of negative trends that impact on local economies, such as online shopping and so on. So they're trying to figure out, okay, how can we ensure that we have a vibrant economy that's inclusive, that provides opportunities for many people as possible. But there are many challenges associated with this, with the notion of the ethical city. For instance, this idea of a shared vision or shared values, how do we get there? Especially in very highly diverse cities, which cities tend to have very high diverse populations. They tend to attract a lot of migrants. So how do you find a shared moral operating system? And then in this notion of a collectivist community based on democratic decision-making, how do you ensure that the majority don't dominate the minorities? And then when we try to redefine prosperity and wealth, how do we do so without creating resentment between winners and losers? There's the highly wealthy people aren't going to just give up their wealth for the greater good. They're going to resent higher levels of taxation and so on and so forth, or distribution of wealth, and they're going to fight against it. So how do we redefine these things in a way that are going to overcome sort of entrenched battles that go on for a very long period of time? And then I guess as we move towards this rapid transition to net zero, how do you do this in a just, fair way? There's obviously going to be a lot of losers in certain industrial sectors. You could think of people working in the fossil fuel sector. How do you do that in a fair way? And how do we deal with this term of the sacrifice of desired consumption? In other words, it is inevitable that we're going to have to change our patterns of consumption. And how do you deal with the fact that up until now there hasn't been any notion of personal limits or efforts to minimize your impact on the planet? Now I realize that sort of ties into this notion of you as the individual responsible for solving the problems, but it's also a notion of collective consumption. Can we change the patterns of consumption collectively so that we don't necessarily have to sacrifice, but we can share? For instance, we can have a new ways of dealing with it. So that's the end of the second part of my presentation.